This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to our exploration of the United Arab Emirates, a nation often viewed as a seamless global powerhouse. But beneath the glittering skylines lies a complex historical rivalry between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. In this narration, we'll trace the roots of this friction, from 19th-century tribal splits to high-stakes financial bailouts and the clashing foreign policies of today. We'll examine the struggle between Dubai's merchant autonomy and Abu Dhabi's centralized security vision. Join us as we go beyond the glass facades to uncover the rifts shaping the Federation's destiny. Chapter 1: The Desert and the Creek. The modern image of the United Arab Emirates is one of seamless unity, a federation of 7 emirates standing as a singular, high-tech powerhouse on the global stage. But to understand the friction currently vibrating through the halls of power in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, one must look past the glass facades and into the foundational years of the union. The relationship between the Al Nahyan and Al Maktoum dynasties was never a simple partnership of equals. It was a marriage of necessity born out of existential dread. Built upon a history of tribal secession and fundamentally different visions of sovereignty. The roots of this tension stretch back to 1833, long before the first drop of oil was pulled from the sand. Both the Al Nahyan and the Al Maktoum belonged to the Bani Yas, a powerful tribal confederation that dominated the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. However, a significant faction of the tribe, led by the Al Maktoum family, chose to break away from the main body in Abu Dhabi. They moved north, settling along the mouth of a natural saltwater inlet known as the Dubai Creek. This was not merely a change of address, it was a declaration of independence. While the Al Nahyan remained a land-based power, focused on the strategic oases of the interior and the complex tribal alliances of the deep desert, the Al Maktoum looked toward the sea. They transformed Dubai into a merchant enclave, a place where survival depended on trade, pearls, and an openness to the Indian Ocean world. From the very beginning, the desert and the creek represented 2 distinct political identities, one rooted in territorial control, the other in commercial autonomy. This historical divide took on a new urgency in the late 1960s, when the British government announced in 1968 that it would withdraw its military protection from the region. The small trucial states were left vulnerable. To the north lay a revolutionary Iran, and to the west a powerful Saudi Arabia that held long-standing territorial claims over the region. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi and Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum of Dubai met to discuss the possibility of a union. The meeting took place in February 1968 at a remote desert outpost called Al Sumai, located on the border between the 2 emirates. At Al Sumai, the 2 leaders struck a foundational bargain, but their motivations were starkly different. Sheikh Zayed, whom local newspapers would later celebrate as the visionary and the sage of the Arab world, believed that a strong, centralized federal state was the only way to ensure survival. He was prepared to use Abu Dhabi's burgeoning oil wealth, discovered just a decade earlier, to bankroll the new nation. Sheikh Rashid, the pragmatic merchant ruler, was far more cautious. He wanted the security of a federation, but feared that a powerful central government in Abu Dhabi would stifle Dubai's commercial freedom. The compromise they reached allowed for a federation, but one where each emirate retained significant control over its internal affairs and, crucially, its own resources. The fragility of this union was tested almost immediately by external pressures. In 1974, the UAE faced a diplomatic crisis with Saudi Arabia, which had refused to recognize the new federation due to a bitter border dispute with Abu Dhabi over the Al Buraimi oasis. To secure Saudi recognition, Abu Dhabi was forced to sign the Treaty of Jeddah, ceding a corridor of land to the Saudis. This territorial loss had a profound psychological impact on the Al Nahyan. It reinforced their belief that the UAE needed a massive, unified federal military to protect its remaining borders. For Abu Dhabi, national security was an existential priority that required the total integration of all regional forces. Dubai, however, saw things differently. To Sheikh Rashid, a unified military was a double-edged sword. While it provided protection against external enemies, it also gave Abu Dhabi the means to exert domestic control over the other emirates. Throughout the 1970s, Dubai engaged in what federal officials in Abu Dhabi viewed as military freelancing. In a move that signaled its desire for defense autonomy, Dubai independently pursued its own arms deals, famously purchasing Scud missiles from North Korea. This was a direct challenge to the federal authority Zayed was trying to build. To the Al Nahyan, Dubai was acting like a rogue state within the Union. To the Al Maktoum, they were simply ensuring they had the leverage to protect their independence. This friction reached a breaking point in 1978 in a military standoff that nearly collapsed the federation. The crisis was sparked when Sheikh Zayed issued a federal decree appointing his son, Sheikh Sultan bin Zayed, as the commander-in-chief of the UAE armed forces. In Dubai, this was seen as a move to personalize the military, turning a federal institution into an extension of the Al Nahyan family's power. Sheikh Rashid reacted with fury, viewing the appointment as a violation of the spirit of the Al Sumay Agreement. The situation escalated rapidly. Military units from Abu Dhabi and Dubai took up opposing positions, and for a tense period, the prospect of an internal civil war was real. The standoff revealed the deep-seated tribal loyalties that still operated beneath the surface of the modern state. The sage, Zayed, and the merchant, Rashid, were no longer just heads of state. They were tribal patriarchs defending their respective domains. The conflict was eventually de-escalated through a series of high-level compromises that allowed Dubai to maintain a degree of operational control over its own security interests, but the trust between the two families was permanently scarred. The divergence in their worldviews extended to foreign policy, particularly regarding Iran. In 1971, just days before the Federation was officially born, Iranian forces occupied 3 strategic islands, Greater and Lesser Tombs and Abu Musa. For Abu Dhabi, this was a clear act of aggression by a regional bully, necessitating a hawkish security posture. But Dubai, true to its merchant roots, refused to let the island dispute sever its economic lifelines. The Dubai Creek remained a vital artery for trade with Iranian ports, and the Al Maktoum family continued to welcome Iranian merchants and capital. This dual-track approach, where Abu Dhabi saw a threat and Dubai saw a customer, became a permanent feature of the Emirati political landscape. As the 1980s progressed, the two emirates began to develop distinct institutional identities. Abu Dhabi used its oil wealth to build a state-led economy, characterized by large bureaucracies and a focus on national stability. Dubai, lacking Abu Dhabi's vast reserves, doubled down on its model of an agile, debt-fueled commercial hub. This led to an internal race for prestige. If Abu Dhabi built a national university, Dubai would build a world-class port. This competition was not just about bragging rights. It was a struggle to define the identity of the UAE. Was it to be a traditional oil state or a global commercial entrepot? The transition of power to the next generation in the late 1980s and early 1990s added a new layer of complexity to this rivalry. Sheikh Zayed's successor, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed, was often viewed by observers as lacking his father's immense personal charisma. While Zayed had been able to smooth over disputes through the sheer force of his personality and tribal standing, Khalifa was seen as a more pragmatic, perhaps more distant administrator. This shift in leadership style occurred just as Zayed's other sons, most notably Mohammed bin Zayed, began to take on more prominent roles in the security and defense sectors, pushing for an even more assertive and centralized Abu Dhabi. In Dubai, the rise of Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid signaled a new era of hyper-ambition. He sought to transform Dubai from a regional trade hub into a global brand, often operating on a logic that seemed entirely independent of the federal government's goals. The Dubai model became a source of both pride and irritation for the Al Nahyan. They appreciated the prestige it brought to the UAE, but they remained deeply suspicious of the financial risks and the independent foreign contacts that Dubai's growth required. By the end of the 1980s, the foundational friction between the desert and the creek had not been resolved. It had merely been institutionalized. The 1978 military standoff had proven that the Union could survive a crisis, but it also established a precedent where Dubai would always seek to protect its autonomy against Abu Dhabi's centralizing impulses. The two dynasties had learned to coexist, but they were moving in different directions. Abu Dhabi was focused on building a regional power capable of projecting force, while Dubai was focused on building a global city capable of attracting capital. As the geopolitical landscape of the Gulf began to shift with the end of the Cold War and the onset of new regional conflicts, the delicate balance struck at Al Sumai would face a new set of challenges. The question was no longer just about who controlled the army, but how two such different models of governance could continue to share a single national identity. The stage was set for a new era of competition, where the struggle for authority would move from the desert outposts to the global financial markets. How would the merchant and the hawk navigate a world where economic success and national security were becoming increasingly inseparable? Chapter 2: The Banker and the Merchant. As the United Arab Emirates matured beyond its foundational years, the internal map of the Federation began to reveal a profound structural tension. This internal rivalry was framed by a historical warning that Dubai understood better than anyone: the precedent of Bahrain. In the early 20th century, Bahrain was the region's undisputed commercial and financial hub, having been the first to discover oil in 1932. However, Dubai's subsequent rise was essentially a calculated displacement of Bahrain. By creating a superior environment for trade and logistics, the Al Maktoum family effectively siphoned the regional relevance away from Manama. For decades, Dubai operated with the confidence of the victor, but by the early 21st century, the roles were shifting. Abu Dhabi began attempting to do to Dubai exactly what Dubai had once done to Bahrain: use superior capital and state-backed institutional weight to displace the established hub. This rivalry manifested most visibly in the skies. For years, Emirates Airline was the crown jewel of the Dubai model, a global carrier that turned a desert outpost into the world's crossroads. Abu Dhabi, realizing that its oil wealth was a finite leverage point, decided it wanted its own version of that prestige. The launch of Etihad Airways was not just a transportation project, it was a state-funded challenge to Dubai's aviation monopoly. While Emirates operated on a logic of high-volume global transit, Etihad was initially conceived as a national flag carrier designed to ensure that the capital was never dependent on its neighbor for international access. The competition extended into the world of high finance. Dubai had established the Dubai International Financial Center, DIFC, as a Western-style legal enclave that attracted the world's largest banks. Abu Dhabi responded by creating the Abu Dhabi Global Market, ADGM. This was a direct attempt to use the capital's massive sovereign wealth to lure the same institutions. An early indicator of this institutional rift occurred in 2009, when a significant dispute erupted over the location of a proposed GCC central bank. Abu Dhabi's insistence on locating the institution in Riyadh, rather than supporting a more neutral or Dubai-centric financial hub, signaled a willingness to prioritize strategic alignment with Saudi Arabia over Dubai's commercial autonomy. Abu Dhabi leverages its oil-backed state power to forge deep state-to-state strategic bonds that bypass the marketplace. This is illustrated by the Asian premium, a practice where Abu Dhabi charges Asian buyers more for its crude, reflecting its specific leverage over global energy markets. The capital uses this oil power to forge alliances that are not just business deals, but long-term geopolitical assets. For instance, when Abu Dhabi granted India's state-owned oil companies a 10% stake in the Lower Zakum offshore concession, it was not just a commercial transaction, it was the purchase of a long-term strategic partnership. This oil-backed statecraft allows Abu Dhabi to project power in a way that trade-based models cannot replicate. Dubai's pursuit of commercial autonomy, meanwhile, has been driven by the global expansion of DP World. While Abu Dhabi focuses on state-to-state defense pacts, Dubai has built a networked empire of ports. By securing long-term concessions in places like Berbera in Somaliland, Bosaso in Puntland, and Kismayo in Jubaland, Dubai has created its own maritime corridor. This strategy is designed to ensure that Dubai remains the indispensable middleman of the Indian Ocean, regardless of the federal government's official diplomatic stance. This commercial activity has often been a source of friction, as Dubai's port diplomacy sometimes clashes with the capital's more rigid security priorities in the Horn of Africa. The rivalry has even reached the realm of cultural soft power. While Dubai focused on being the entertainment and tourism capital of the region, a place of malls, theme parks, and spectacle, Abu Dhabi sought a more permanent form of prestige. The construction of the Louvre Abu Dhabi was a signal that the capital intended to be the cultural and intellectual center of the Federation. This was a zero-sum game for global attention. Abu Dhabi was using its budget to buy into the very sectors that Dubai had spent 30 years perfecting, effectively telling the world that the capital could also be a global curator. The arrival of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 added a massive new complication to this internal rivalry. Under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia began an aggressive push to modernize its economy, often using the Dubai model as a blueprint. Abu Dhabi's leadership, however, chose to align itself closely with the Saudi rise, even when it directly threatened Dubai's interests. The most pointed example of this is the Saudi Regional Headquarters Rule, which mandates that multinational companies must move their regional bases to the kingdom to qualify for government contracts. This rule was a direct shot at Dubai, which currently holds a 70 to 76% share of all regional headquarters. Many in the Dubai business community viewed Abu Dhabi's strategic silence on this rule as a form of complicity, suggesting that the capital was willing to see Dubai's commercial dominance eroded if it meant a stronger security alliance with Riyadh. As the 21st century progressed, the competition was no longer just about who had the best airline or the most prestigious museum. It was about who controlled the strategic map of the nation. Abu Dhabi's decision to use its wealth to build a state that could act independently of its neighbors and even its own federation partners signaled a new era of centralization. The dream of a decentralized, autonomous trade hub was being slowly enveloped by a vision of a unified, disciplined state. This shift in the balance of power was not merely about budgets, it was about the ultimate direction of the country. Abu Dhabi's control over the federal budget and the national oil company gave it the ultimate leverage over the country's direction. The pursuit of autonomy had left the city-state with few options as the capital's vision of a unified state began to take precedence over the historical independence of the coast. Chapter 3: The Price of the Lifeline. To the outside world, the final weeks of 2009 were supposed to be a celebration of Dubai's seemingly unstoppable ascent. The city was preparing to open the world's tallest building, a shimmering needle of steel and glass that pierced the desert clouds, symbolizing a new era of Arab prosperity. But beneath the celebratory lights of the Sheikh Zayed Road, a financial earthquake was about to strike, one that would fundamentally reorder the power balance within the United Arab Emirates and give Abu Dhabi the opening it had sought for decades to re-in its more flamboyant neighbor. The crisis did not begin with a whimper, but with a shockwave that rattled global stock markets from London to New York. On the eve of the American Thanksgiving holiday, the Dubai government made a brief cryptic announcement. Its flagship investment vehicle, Dubai World, was asking for a standstill on its massive debt payments. The city that had spent years branding itself as a safe haven for global capital was essentially admitting it was broke. The numbers were staggering. Dubai World alone owed nearly $60 billion, part of a wider $80 billion debt mountain that had been used to build artificial islands, luxury hotels, and a global logistics empire.
For the international banking community, it was a moment of sheer panic. The exposure was not abstract. It was concentrated in the boardrooms of the world's most powerful financial institutions. HSBC held the largest stake with $16 billion in exposure, followed by Standard Chartered with $8 billion and Barclays with $4 billion. As the tickers turned red, the collapse of Dubai's global empire was illustrated by the fate of its trophy assets. In London, the Adelphi building, a prime piece of the Dubai World portfolio, saw its market value sink below its debt level. It was the ultimate symbol of an empire that was officially underwater. For Abu Dhabi, however, it was a moment of profound strategic silence. As markets crashed and analysts speculated on whether the entire federation would collapse, the capital remained eerily quiet. This was not an accidental delay in communication. It was a calculated political move. Insiders at the time described it as a deafening silence. Abu Dhabi, sitting on its vast ocean of oil wealth and sovereign funds, was sending a message to Dubai. Your pursuit of autonomy has a price, and that price is now due. The standoff in late 2009 was a high-stakes game of chicken. Dubai World's most immediate problem was a $3.5 billion Islamic bond, or sukuk, issued by its real estate arm, Nakheel. It was due on December 14th. If Dubai missed that payment, it would trigger a cross-default that could bring down the city's entire financial system. Interestingly, sources later revealed that Dubai World actually possessed $5 billion in credit from Abu Dhabi-based banks at the time. However, the leadership in Dubai chose to call for a standstill anyway, attempting to force all creditors to the table simultaneously. It was the high finance equivalent of mutually assured destruction, a desperate attempt by Dubai to use its own potential collapse as leverage against its creditors and its neighbors. The negotiations that followed were grueling. Abu Dhabi's leaders were reportedly unhappy with how Dubai had managed its expansion, and they were determined to use the crisis to demand greater centralization. They wanted to ensure that never again would a single emirate be able to jeopardize the reputation of the entire UAE through unchecked borrowing. But they also wanted to curb Dubai's independent streak in foreign affairs, particularly its role as a commercial gateway for Iran. The succor Abu Dhabi would eventually provide came with strings attached that would effectively clip Dubai's wings. While the world watched the tickers, a quiet struggle for the soul of the federation was taking place. Some analysts at the time described it as a great opportunity for political centralization. Abu Dhabi wanted to move from being the financer of the union to being its undisputed commander. This was not just about money, it was about the political brinkmanship required to force Dubai to align its interests with the capital's strategic vision. The Al Nahyan were no longer content to be the silent partners in Dubai's success. They intended to be the architects of its future. The climax of this drama occurred on the morning of December 14th, the very day the Nakheel bond was set to default. In a dramatic, last-minute intervention, Abu Dhabi provided a $10 billion bailout. $5 billion came from Abu Dhabi-based banks, and another $5 billion was a direct injection from the capital's government. The immediate disaster was averted, and the global markets breathed a sigh of relief. But the cost to Dubai's autonomy was visible for all to see. The bailout was not a gift,
It was a mortgage on Dubai sovereignty.
The most symbolic moment of this shift in power came just a few weeks later at the grand opening of the world's tallest building. For years, it had been known as the Burj Dubai. It was the ultimate monument to the Al Maktoum vision, a vertical city that was supposed to announce Dubai's arrival as a global peer to New York or London. But as the world's cameras rolled and the fireworks exploded, the announcement came. The tower would be renamed the Burj Khalifa in honor of the president of the UAE and the ruler of Abu Dhabi. It was a stunning public acknowledgement of Dubai's subordination. The tallest building in the world, the heart of Dubai's brand, now bore the name of its big brother in the capital. The 2009 crisis did not just change the names on buildings, it fundamentally altered the institutional landscape of the UAE. Following the bailout, Abu Dhabi's influence over Dubai's economic and security policies became more direct. The capital began implementing stricter federal oversight on government-linked entities. The Dubai model of rapid, debt-fueled growth was replaced by a more sober, Abu Dhabi-approved framework. The merchant city had to learn to live with a security state that was increasingly suspicious of its global connections and its historical reliance on trade with regional rivals.
This was a turning point that established a new status quo. The 2009 crisis taught Abu Dhabi that economic vulnerability was a more effective tool of control than military standoffs or tribal negotiations. It established a precedent where the capital could allow Dubai to flourish as a commercial hub, but only within the strategic boundaries set by the Al Nahyan. The fraternal rivalry of the 1970s had been replaced by a creditor-debtor relationship. Abu Dhabi had proven that it was willing to wait for the right moment to strike, and it was willing to let its brothers sweat if it meant securing its own long-term dominance. As the city-state began the slow process of restructuring its billions in debt, it found itself in a world where its every move was scrutinized by the federal authorities in the capital. The leverage exerted in 2009 paved the way for Abu Dhabi to progressively federalize the country's most important assets, from its defense forces to its energy policy. The bailout was a lifeline that became a leash. While Dubai eventually recovered its economic footing, it never truly recovered its political independence. The leadership in the capital had proven that they could use their wealth to enforce a unified vision, even if that vision was one that the Al Maktoum family found increasingly restrictive.
This power dynamic would be tested again and again as the region moved toward a more confrontational era. The 2009 bailout was the moment the dream of a decentralized, merchant-led federation began to fade, replaced by a more assertive and centralized state power. The question was no longer how Dubai would pay its debts, but how it would navigate a future where its traditional pursuit of neutrality was no longer an option. As Abu Dhabi began to align the federation with a more hawkish regional posture, the merchant families of the Creek were forced to realize that their ledger was now subject to the prince's strategic map. How would Dubai's historical reliance on trade with Iran survive when the capital finally decided to use its financial leverage to force a final choice between commerce and command?
Chapter 4: The Merchant and the Hawk. To understand the friction between the two most powerful cities in the United Arab Emirates, you have to stand on the edge of the Dubai Creek and watch the wooden dhows. These vessels, with their weathered hulls and tangled rigging, are the physical manifestation of an economic approach that has defined Dubai for over a century. For generations, these boats have shuttled back and forth across the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf, carrying everything from high-end electronics and household appliances to basic foodstuffs and industrial parts. Their destination is almost always the same, the ports of southern Iran. This trade isn't just a line item in a budget, it is the heartbeat of Dubai's merchant class, a group that has historically viewed the water not as a border but as a bridge. In Abu Dhabi, however, those same waters are viewed through a lens of strategic threat and military command. The Al Nahyan family, looking out from the capital, sees a revolutionary power in Tehran that has been a source of instability since 1979. This divergence in perspective has become one of the most significant points of contention within the Emirati Federation. While Dubai has spent decades positioning itself as the lungs of the Iranian economy, providing a vital gateway for a country often choked by international sanctions, Abu Dhabi has been building a security posture designed to contain and confront Iranian influence. Dubai's leadership, the Al Maktoum family, realized early on that the city's survival depended on being an open, neutral platform for global commerce. They cultivated a risk-tolerant identity, welcoming anyone who wanted to do business. This included a massive Iranian diaspora that settled in Dubai, building businesses, banks, and social networks that deeply intertwined the two economies. For the merchants of Dubai, regional disputes were diplomatic issues to be managed, not reasons to commit economic suicide. They believed that by making themselves indispensable to Iran's economy, they were actually creating a form of security through interdependence. If Dubai was the primary exit point for Iranian capital and the primary entry point for its goods, Tehran would have a vested interest in the city's stability. This diplomacy stands in contrast to Abu Dhabi's statecraft. While Abu Dhabi uses its wealth to forge rigid geopolitical alliances, Dubai relies on a web of informal and formal trade links. Abu Dhabi's map of the region is one of hard borders and military alliances. Dubai's map is one of supply chains and customer bases. This difference is illustrated by how the two cities leverage their respective strengths. Abu Dhabi uses its position as a primary producer to build political capital, whereas Dubai's merchants must remain agile and accommodating to maintain their role as the region's middleman. The tension between these two maps has reached a breaking point, as Abu Dhabi has begun using its federal authority to turn the screws on Dubai's merchant class. In recent years, the capital has implemented stricter federal oversight on financial transactions, ostensibly to comply with international anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing standards. However, in the boardrooms of Dubai, this is often seen as a targeted strike against the city's Iranian trade. Banks in Dubai, once known for their flexibility, have been forced by federal regulators in Abu Dhabi to close the accounts of Iranian businessmen and subject every transaction involving the cross-Gulf trade to exhaustive scrutiny. For the merchant families who have traded with Iran for a century, this feels like a betrayal, an attempt by the capital to sacrifice Dubai's prosperity on the altar of a security vision that many in the merchant city feel is unnecessarily provocative. The strategic dread felt by Dubai's commercial elite is not abstract. It is fueled by incidents that suggest Abu Dhabi's posture is inviting the very conflict Dubai has tried to avoid. A major point of contention arose when a Chinese-made Wing-Lung 2 drone, operated by the UAE, was reportedly downed over Shiraz in Iran. The incident sparked international questions about whether the UAE was conducting active airstrikes or surveillance deep inside Iranian territory. For Dubai's merchant class, such provocations are terrifying. They understand that while Abu Dhabi's military infrastructure is tucked away in the desert or protected by advanced missile batteries, Dubai's wealth is concentrated in vulnerable, glass-fronted skyscrapers and exposed port facilities. A single retaliatory strike on a Dubai terminal would do more damage to the Dubai brand than a year of sanctions. This vulnerability is something Tehran has explicitly sought to weaponize. Iranian officials have reportedly told their Saudi counterparts in private that they plan to crush the Emiratis if hostilities escalated, specifically mentioning the Riyadh-Abu Dhabi rift as a point of exploitation. The Iranians recognize that the UAE is not a monolith. They see the friction between Dubai's economic reliance on Iran and Abu Dhabi's military alignment against it. By threatening the UAE, Iran is specifically targeting the stability of Dubai, knowing that the merchant city has the most to lose and the least appetite for a confrontation that Abu Dhabi seems increasingly willing to risk. The Abraham Accords, while celebrated in Abu Dhabi as a masterstroke of realpolitik, have only deepened this internal rift. In the capital, the alliance with Israel is seen as a way to access advanced defense technology and create a powerful new front against Iranian regional meddling. But in Dubai, the accords were viewed through a much more anxious lens. While the city welcomed the influx of Israeli tourists and tech investors, the merchant families were acutely aware that this alliance made Dubai a prime target. The city that had thrived on being a bridge to the entire region was now being forced to choose a side. The fear is that the more Dubai becomes integrated into Abu Dhabi's security-first axis with Israel, the more it loses its historical status as a neutral ground where even enemies could do business. This disagreement over Iran is also reflected in the demographic and cultural fabric of the two cities. Abu Dhabi is a place where the local population is more traditional and more closely tied to the state's security apparatus. In Dubai, the population is more cosmopolitan, with the Iranian diaspora playing a central role in the city's identity for over a century. Many of Dubai's most prominent merchant families have ancestral roots in southern Iran, and they maintain deep cultural and familial ties across the water. To these families, the Iranian threat described by the capital feels like an attack on their own heritage and their own neighbors. They see the capital's policy not as a necessary defense of the nation, but as an obsession that ignores the commercial and social realities of the coast.
The lungs metaphor remains the most accurate way to describe the relationship. Dubai provides the oxygen that allows the Iranian economy to survive under pressure, and in return, that trade provides the lifeblood for Dubai's ports and markets. Abu Dhabi, however, is increasingly of the mind that these lungs should be constricted. The capital's leadership believes that in a world of revolutionary expansionism and drone warfare, there is no room for a merchant city to freelance its own foreign policy. They have concluded that the interdependence Dubai views as security is actually a form of strategic blackmail. As federal oversight continues to tighten and the regional temperature rises, the merchant families of the Creek find themselves in a precarious position. They are watching the slow dismantling of a trade model that survived the Iran-Iraq War, the fall of the Shah, and decades of international pressure. They see their city being reshaped by a power dynamic that favors the capital over the merchants on the coast. The question that now haunts the moduluses of Dubai is whether the city can remain a global commercial hub if it is no longer allowed to be a neutral one. Can the Dubai model survive when the capital decides that the cost of doing business with the neighbor is simply too high for the security of the state? The dhows still move across the creek, but they are sailing into a future where the map is no longer being drawn by the men who own the boats, but by the men who command the drones. What happens to a merchant city when its own government decides that its most important trade route is actually its greatest existential threat?
Chapter 5. The Broken Mirage.
The skyline of Dubai has always been a carefully curated mirage of safety, a place where the world's capital could rest easy while the rest of the Middle East grappled with its ancient ghosts. For decades, the Al Maktoum family sold the world a specific promise that Dubai was a neutral ground, an open market oasis where the only thing that mattered was the deal. But as the region descended into the catastrophic Iran-Israel war of the mid-2020s, that mirage finally began to evaporate. The trade with Iran, once the essential lifeblood of the city's economy, was now being choked by the smoke of incoming fire. The sky over the Burj Khalifa, once filled with the glittering lights of long-haul passenger jets, became a theater for interceptor missiles and Iranian drones. For Dubai, the war was not just a security crisis, it was the final, crushing blow to its historical model of commercial autonomy. The unified front of the United Arab Emirates has fractured, exposing a reality where Dubai's merchant identity is being systematically sacrificed to serve Abu Dhabi's hawkish strategic defense priorities. The physical toll on Dubai has been impossible to hide behind the usual gloss of public relations.
During the height of the conflict, the UAE was hit by an unprecedented barrage of at least 2,000 Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. One of the most jarring symbols of this new era was the shuttering of the Burj Al Arab, the sail-shaped hotel that defined Dubai's luxury brand. Struck by a projectile in the early days of the war, the hotel remained closed for 18 months for renovations, a silent monument to the city's vulnerability. The vital organ of cross-Gulf trade was no longer a source of life, but a magnet for destruction. The war reached the very infrastructure that sustained the Emirati dream, with strikes hitting critical oil facilities such as Mina Al Hamadi and high-profile energy installations in Fujairah. For the merchant class of Dubai, this was the nightmare they had spent 50 years trying to avoid. Their city was no longer a neutral hub, it was a frontline target. In the capital, however, the mood was not one of retreat, but of a cold, calculated strategic break. Abu Dhabi National Oil Company had already announced a massive $150 billion investment to expand production capacity, and the Al Nahyan leadership was no longer willing to let their ambitions be clipped by the traditional rules of the region. On April 28, 2026, the UAE delivered a bombshell that reverberated far beyond the oil markets. It was withdrawing from OPEC, OPEC+, and the Kuwait-headquartered OAPC. This was not merely a dispute over production quotas, it was a declaration of total autonomy. By exiting, the UAE removed 12% of OPEC's total oil output and deprived the cartel of one of its few remaining swing producers.
This OPEC exit was a purely political, long-term play, rather than an immediate economic windfall. While Abu Dhabi signaled that the era of deference to a Saudi-led cartel was over, the move was constrained by physical reality. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, the UAE's primary route to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, was already operating at or near full capacity. This meant that even with its newfound freedom from quotas, Abu Dhabi could not immediately monetize its exit while the strait remained a graveyard of tankers. The withdrawal was a message of defiance, timed with surgical precision to coincide with a Gulf summit in Jeddah intended to show a unified Gulf stance against Iran. In a move seen as a deliberate insult to the Saudi hosts, UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed opted not to attend, sending his foreign minister instead. As Professor Fawaz Gergis observed, what we're seeing now is a kind of breakdown between the two most powerful leaders in the Gulf. While Dubai watched its hotel occupancy rates plummet and its trade routes get strangled, Abu Dhabi was leaning into a new, controversial alliance that fundamentally reordered the region. The relationship with Israel moved into an unprecedented military phase. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu secretly ordered the deployment of an Israeli Iron Dome interceptor battery along with Israeli soldiers to operate it on Emirati soil. This was the first time Israeli troops had ever been stationed in an Arab state. For the Al Nahyan, this was a necessary strategic bet. They believed their security rested with those who had stood firmly by them during the crisis, Israel and the United States, rather than the weak Arab partners who had offered only insipid solidarity.
This deepening military alliance with Israel was a death knell for Dubai's open market model. The city's historical role as a gateway for Iranian trade was now a direct liability. Saudi media and influencers, sanctioned at the highest levels in Riyadh, began a ferocious propaganda war. Saudi analysts like Salman al-Okali lambasted Abu Dhabi for investing in chaos and creating an axis of fragmentation in the region. This narrative war directly targeted Dubai's reputation as a neutral ground, making it impossible for the city to maintain its delicate balancing act. Riyadh was essentially telling global investors that if they wanted access to the region's largest market, they could no longer use Dubai as a neutral staging ground. The strategic divergence reached a bloody climax in the proxy wars of the South. In December 2025 and into 2026, the friction over Yemen boiled over into direct confrontation. Saudi jets launched strikes on UAE-linked shipments in the port of Mukalla, accusing Abu Dhabi of betrayal and of empowering secessionist militias that threatened the sovereignty of neighboring states. These strikes signaled the final collapse of the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council's ambitions and marked the very public divorce between the two most powerful men in the Arab world. For Dubai, these military escalations were a catastrophe. Every Saudi strike on an Emirati-linked asset was a blow to the perception of the UAE as a stable place to do business. To bypass the merchant model that Dubai had perfected, Abu Dhabi turned to state-to-state oil statecraft. Unlike Dubai's reliance on a network of private traders, Abu Dhabi secured its future through massive state-level concessions. By giving global powers a direct stake in its energy infrastructure, Abu Dhabi was buying a long-term geopolitical insurance policy that did not require the open market optics of Dubai. This strategic pivot has forced a rebalancing of power that favors Abu Dhabi's centralized command over Dubai's networked autonomy. The capital has effectively federalized the nation's survival, telling Dubai that the merchant's ledger is now secondary to the prince's strategic map. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz only reinforced this hierarchy. While Abu Dhabi could at least move its oil through the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, Dubai had no such escape route for its commercial trade. The city's entire economic model was physically tied to a waterway that was now a war zone. The fracturing of the Emirati front is visible in the way the two cities now engage with the world. Abu Dhabi is building its own axis focused on defense and technology, while Saudi Arabia counters with a Saudi-Turkey-Pakistan alignment. Pakistan, traditionally a close partner of both, was pulled further into the Saudi orbit, signing a strategic mutual defense agreement with Riyadh in 2025. This left the UAE feeling isolated, leading to rare public rebukes from officials like Anwar Gargash, who called the stance of fellow Gulf monarchies the weakest in history. There is even growing speculation that Abu Dhabi may freeze its participation in the Arab League or the Gulf Cooperation Council, viewing them as dysfunctional bodies that no longer serve its interests. The Dubai model relied on the idea that you could ignore politics and just focus on business. But the Iran war has proven that in the 21st century, politics eventually finds you. The city that thrived on being a bridge to everyone is now a fortified outpost for a few. Its historical trade with Iran is being dismantled by federal sanctions. Its reputation for safety is being tested by Iranian missiles. And its commercial autonomy is being eroded by the capital's demand for a unified strategic front. Abu Dhabi has proven that it can survive a world at war, but it is not yet clear if Dubai can. The country is no longer a collection of 7 emirates working toward a shared merchant dream. It is a centralized security power led from Abu Dhabi, with Dubai serving as its increasingly constrained commercial outlet. The merchant city has been forced to accept that its prosperity is now a secondary concern to the security state. As the dhows in the Dubai Creek sit idle and the Iron Dome batteries on the coast stand ready, the true cost of the Saudi-Emirati rift becomes clear. It is a cost measured in lost investment, fractured alliances, and a regional order that is more volatile than ever. The unified front that once stood as a model for the Arab world is gone, replaced by a rivalry that is tearing the region apart. Abu Dhabi has chosen its path of strategic defense and national autonomy, but it is a path that leaves Dubai's open market dream in the rearview mirror. As the desert finally reclaims the city, the question remains, how much longer can the Federation itself hold together when its heart and its head are no longer part of the same body? The centuries-old tension between Abu Dhabi's desert and Dubai's creek has evolved from tribal disputes into a high-stakes struggle for the soul of the UAE. While the 2009 bailout and recent regional conflicts have allowed Abu Dhabi to centralize power and prioritize a hawkish security agenda, this shift comes at a steep price for Dubai's historical model of commercial neutrality.
The broader implications are clear. The Federation is no longer a collection of autonomous partners, but a disciplined, state-led powerhouse. As the merchant is increasingly eclipsed by the hawk, the UAE faces a fundamental question. Can a nation built on the promise of open trade survive in a future defined by rigid strategic alliances and military command? The mirage of unity may be fading, but the reality of a new, assertive power is just beginning. Thank you for listening.